Welcome. Thank you. Uh, as the introduction said, my name is David Montgomery. I host the Siècle History podcast. I cover 19th century French history from 1814 to 1914, in between Napoleon and the First World War. The topic of this conference today is escape. And so I'm going to be talking to you about people who escaped from revolutionary France, just ahead of the guillotine. And more to the point, I'm going to talk to you about what happened when they tried to go home. Because at this moment of triumph, this long dream for return, many of these émigrés found that the topic of this conference is escape. And I'm going to talk to you about a group of people who escaped from revolutionary France, fleeing overseas, fleeing abroad to escape the guillotine and the rest of the French Revolution. And more to the point, I'm going to talk to you about what happened when they tried to go home and the rather unexpected consequences that they had to discover when they finally accomplished what they've been longing for all these years. So first of all, a bit of brief background. France, as you are aware, had a little thing called a revolution. Eventually, after much Sturm und Drang, the monarchy was overthrown. Lots of people were guillotined. So in this period, you had a lot of people who felt that they were unable to survive the revolution. That is, nobles who knew that they were compromised in some way, knew that they were targeted by the Committee for Public Safety, and that if they stuck around, they were going to die. There's also another group who maybe weren't in imminent danger, but were morally unable to accept the changes that were going on with the French Revolution. So members of both these groups fled France. So who were these émigrés? There's been a lot of scholarly debate in this topic, but the general consensus is that there were perhaps 130,000 of them or so who fled France. These were people of varied social status, and they went to various different places. The stereotypical émigré is the noble. Rich aristocrat, powdered wig, all that stuff. And this is partially true. There were about perhaps there were perhaps 20,000 French nobles who emigrated. And this included most of the most socially prominent and famous émigrés. Obviously included the king, Louis XVIII, in exile, his brothers, his nephews, various princes of the blood. All the most famous and wealthiest émigrés fell into this category. Some people are under the impression that the French Revolution killed all the nobles in France, and that's just not true. It's also not true that they all emigrated. That 20,000 figure or so includes about 15% of all French nobles, though again, this is also heavily debated in the scholarly literature. But again, I said that 130,000 people emigrated during the Revolution, which means that only a fraction of these émigrés were nobles. So, if not nobles, who were they? Well, a lot of them were priests, clergy. The French Revolution tried to control and later destroy the Catholic Church. Many priests refused to swear allegiance to the revolutionary government. Many were killed. About 3,000 clergy were killed during the revolution. Some 20,000 left the faith, and around 40,000 emigrated. That's about 25% of all the clergy in France. So larger numbers and larger relatively than the nobles. These were often less prominent people, so they get less attention. Less prominent people, so they get less attention. But they were more significant in many ways. Here you can see a contemporary English cartoon showing the emigrant clergy reading a decree saying that they were not going to be able to go home and reacting in anguished distress. The English, as we'll see soon, had mixed feelings about all these French Catholic emigres taking shelter in their land. So in addition to the priests and the nobles, a majority of all the emigres were in fact commoners, which is certainly not the stereotype of the French emigration. Why? Well, a lot of these people were fairly low social status. This includes all the servants that nobles took with them when they went overseas. There's also a fair number of peasant sailors and other low-status people who hopped across the border, often hopping right back for fairly short periods of time. And finally, this is not significant because while 15% of nobles and 25% of clerics emigrated, less than 1% of the third estate, of the commoners, left the country. So it's just much less significant as a share of the total population, as the share of their social group. So emigres went everywhere. Many went to Austria or Russia. A lot went to the United States. But London and England was the epicenter of the French emigration. Most of the most prominent and wealthiest emigres ended up there. The king's brother was there. Eventually the king went there. And one of the attractions to London is that the British were rich, and they were safe from Napoleon, safe from the French Revolutionary armies. And emigres in England were able to draw a subsidy from the British government, so they wouldn't starve to death. The British felt that it was their duty to welcome these refugees in and to give them enough to live on. But this wasn't a lot of money. And a lot of these French emigres, former bewigged aristocrats and monks and priests and all that, were forced to do something terrifying: work for a living. Part of that was because, of course, the French government did what it could to stop the emigres from benefiting from their vast assets in France, confiscating them, sequestering them, otherwise trying to do whatever they could to stop moving assets overseas. So we have a few examples of aristocrats forced to take up fairly menial jobs. The Comtesse de Saint-Saval started a business making straw hats. The Marquise de la Tour du Pin became a linen worker. The Duchesse de Gontaut sold paintings. The Duc d'Orléans, a future king of France, worked as a teacher. Now, it was possible to go too far here. One chevalier of the Order of St. Louis, a prominent honor society, was court-martialed and expelled by his peers in the order for the crime of becoming a servant. It's just not going to work well, but other emigres, of course, did a variety of options. Those who had money lived in idleness when they could. Some wrote books or poems that they published. Some worked for the British government as spies or soldiers, joining the army. But in general, this was not the most pleasant time of their lives for these aristocrats. Even the ones who weren't penniless were generally making do with much less than they had before, and their resources were donations from other people in many cases. Jesus, I'm just a mess. But eventually, the situation in France changed. Robespierre fell, the guillotine slowed down, the reign of terror ended, and lots of French emigres felt that maybe they could go back home. There were waves of returnees, especially as Napoleon took power and tried to bring many of these exiles back. In 1800, a decree let any emigres who hadn't taken up arms against France come home. In 1802, even those people who'd taken up arms were allowed to come back. In 1801, Napoleon agreed to a concordat with the Vatican, striking a truce with the Catholic Church, and most of the priests went back home then. Now, there were a few thousand diehards who remained in exile all the way until Napoleon's fall in 1814. But still, the alacrity with which most emigres returned at the first possible moment was a little bit embarrassing to these true believers. The leader of the emigres in England, the Comte d'Artois, was basically forced to give the returning emigres his blessing, after being advised that they would return regardless, so he better make it look like he approved. So, in various waves, these emigres came back home to France. And here I'd like to focus on what they came back to, which was, in short, less money, less status, and less power. First, let's talk about the money. The French Revolution confiscated huge swaths of property. This included enormous amounts of church land that had previously provided incomes to support the operations of bishops, churches, monasteries, nunneries, abbeys, all sorts of stuff. All huge swaths of this were just confiscated by the French Revolutionary government and resold. There was also a law passed that confiscated the property of emigres, which particularly meant noble emigres. If you left the country and refused to come back, then the government took your land. And up to 1/5 of all noble property in France was confiscated this way. Beyond this, the revolution abolished a lot of the noble privileges that had made life as a noble so cushy in Ancien Regime France. This included a famous tax exemption that the French nobility had had. Before the revolution, the nobles were exempt from paying many taxes. Afterwards, taxes were applied evenly to everyone. So before 1789, perhaps 5% of noble wealth was taken by taxes. The uniform land tax after 1789 was 16%. Pre-revolution nobles also made a lot of money from a load of so-called seigneurial dues or feudal dues. These were various privileges that nobles had, a right to force their peasants on their lands to give them. So, for example, nobles might have a right to a share of their peasants' crops. They might have a monopoly on the use of the village's mill or olive press. They might be able to receive fees for land transfers or marriages. And even the so-called corvée, which is unpaid labor, the ability to force peasants to do unpaid labor on the lord's lands. The revolution got rid of all of this. As a result, many nobles found that large parts of their income had disappeared. So when these emigres came home, they were happy to be back in France. But many found themselves returning to poverty, or at least what seemed like poverty. So one estimate is that the average provincial noble family saw its annual income during the revolution reduced by about a third, from about 8,000 francs before to 5,200 francs after. Of course, the average peasant farmer in this time might earn 300 or 400 francs per year, so it's important to keep this poverty in perspective. The Marquise de la Tour du Pin, who I mentioned earlier, working in the linen industry, lamented that the revolution ruined my father-in-law, and our family fortunes never recovered. She estimated that her family's income was slashed by 58,000 francs per year. Of course, that left them with 22,000 per year. So while their circumstances were certainly reduced, they were far from peasants. Of course, most nobles weren't quite so rich. A common lament among the embarrassed returning emigres was, "Where shall I go to hide my poverty?" So what did you do if you came home and found yourself suddenly poor? Well, it was embarrassing. Many were forced to work. The Marquise de La Tour du Pin said her illustrious family have been forced to contrive a living, sometimes by sale of the few possessions remaining to us, sometimes by taking salaried posts. Some impoverished nobles were so embarrassed by their poverty that they just stopped acting like nobles, pretended to be commoners. They stopped using the use of their title, their seal, and visiting cards. It was less embarrassing to pretend to be just an ordinary commoner than a noble who happened to not have any money. Those who did have some money often used it to try to buy back their confiscated property from the people who had purchased it from the government. Sometimes these buyers agreed to sell, which restored both the pride and the income to these emigre families. But though much property did return to its original owners, this wasn't easy. One emigre lamented, "Many emigres, more fortunate than ourselves, retained a part of their land. By strict economy and great activity, they found the means to pay the debts contracted for the repurchase of their homes." But also, quote, "There were families destined to go under. Ours never came back. All our efforts to keep ourselves afloat were in vain." Beyond the money, there was also social consequences. So the clergy who came back home after the Concordat found that they were now state employees, far from belonging to an independent branch of the church that was funded through vast land holdings and a direct 10% tithe levied on the population. Priests now worked for the government, drew a salary. This was certainly less prestigious. When noble emigres returned, they were officially just common citizens. Titles and nobility were suppressed. It was illegal for them to display their family coats of arms. Now, a little later, after 1808, Napoleon created his own titles of nobility. But that just meant that the old line nobility now had to share their status with up-jumped commoners, which, if you've met any nobles, did not go well with them. Nobles also found they'd lost their local social prestige. Instead of being feudal lords, these returned emigres found that they were now merely landlords. Their former tenants were now their equals before the law, if not in wealth. And these former tenants now, not uncommonly, showed this equality by taking their former lord to court. Loss of power was also a key issue. Before the revolution, emigres had effectively a monopoly on access to government power both at the central level and at the local level. Those who returned now found that their power was all but gone, unless they earned it again by working for Napoleon. Even this was often tenuous. Napoleon could fire you anytime he wanted. Or worse, as the famous writer Chateaubriand found out when he published a pamphlet attacking Napoleon. The emperor shut down Chateaubriand's newspaper, seized his property, and almost arrested him. Of course, many former emigres were more circumspect and kept their heads down, working as officials under Napoleon, thus gaining a modicum of power. But even if deep down, this required working with the man they called the usurper, even if they really wished that the Bourbons were ruling France. So then comes 1814. Napoleon is defeated. He abdicates. The Bourbons, in the form of Louis XVIII, were put back on the throne. The final group of emigres, this last couple thousand holdouts, finally came back to France. And things were improved, both for the ones who just came back and the ones who'd already been back working with Napoleon. Former emigres now had new access to power, wealth, and status. The Catholic Church had the Catholic Church had new power and influence. The Bourbon Restoration had a Chamber of Peers, a sort of French equivalent of the House of Lords, whose members had a hereditary appointment with a handsome government salary. Louis created a royal bodyguard, which is staffed by men whose bloodlines were more impressive than their military service. There were civil service jobs. About 70% of Restoration prefects were of noble blood. Many nobles received military appointments, even if they lacked any actual qualifications. This could backfire. I want to focus on one particular example, a noble named Hugh du Chamaret.
The following pronunciation is brought to you. pronouncenames.com.
Hugh de Chamaret. He was a noble emigre, and in 1814 he was appointed to command a frigate in the French Navy, despite the fact that he hadn't put to sea in 2 decades since before the Revolution. On his very first voyage, he crashed his ship into a reef, killing more than 100 people in one of the most infamous shipwrecks before the Titanic. But all this was never enough. For every emigre given a sinecure, many more were denied these cushy jobs that they wanted from the government. The old nobles now had to coexist with the new ones. The Bourbon Restoration preserved the Napoleonic nobility alongside the old Ancien Regime nobility. Clergy were still state employees. The feudal dues were not restored. The confiscated lands weren't returned. Most importantly, overall, the Ancien Regime was not restored. This was a new France. That said, many of these returned emigres still felt that they had power. They felt that the government was on their side, or at least ought to be, and threw around their weight. Many of them put pressure on the owners of confiscated land to return it. Some clergy would deny the holy sacraments to anyone who had owned this confiscated land and refused to sell it back. There are also nobles who clung to their old airs of superiority, lording it over their peasants, addressing them with the informal pronoun tu, like they were children. One restored noble from the Pyrenees, his son later recalled, treated his peasants like slaves. Quote, "Woe to whoever didn't remove his hat while speaking to him, for a blow with his walking stick soon knocked off the offending headgear." This condescension wasn't universal, but it was common enough to be noted. A famous song from this period ran, "See this old marquis bloke, treats us like conquered folk." But there was no going back. France had changed for good. You couldn't put the genie back in the bottle. Efforts by nobles and clergy to pressure people over the confiscated property created a huge backlash, so big that it contributed to the brief return of Napoleon in 1815. The confiscated property was never returned en masse to its former owners, though in 1825 many emigres were compensated with money in exchange for their losses. Clergy continued to be paid by state salary instead of a tithe or their restored lands. None of the changes of the emigres thought they could get were ever enacted. They got some. It was better than they had during exile, but they didn't get everything. And yet, many of the émigrés and their descendants lived lives of wealth, power, and privilege after their return. It wasn't the kind they thought they deserved. It wasn't everything they'd had before their exile. And some never recovered it. Some did languish and return into poverty and never regained their former prominence. But lots of them did. They weren't satisfied because it wasn't what they wanted. But that doesn't mean this is a tragedy. Those who were able to adapt to this new world often did quite well for themselves. I have to take your questions in a moment. If you'd like to learn more about this period in French history, you can check out my podcast, The Siècle. It's available everywhere you get podcasts. You can also visit thesiècle.com for full annotated transcripts of each episode, and follow the show on Twitter. Okay, I can do that.